what's the traditional view? God came down, found out that, well, they're speaking one language, and oh man, if we don't do something about this, they're gonna take over everything. So let's confuse their language. The literal meaning was not that people had one language; it's that they had one lip.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Buried Bible Podcast. As always, I'm Keegan Walls. I am the layman, and I'm here with a very smart man named Dr. Scholar Mark Chavalas.
Excuse me, I got to get all my breaths in because we were told that you could hear me breathing and my lips smacking, and of course that's going to be relevant today since we're going to be talking about lips. Anyway, I want to hold my breath so we don't have to.
We're going to do this 4-hour episode in one breath.
Yes.
But no, we got some cool things to share. At least it's cool for us. We're excited about it. Don't worry, they're not for sale. These are exclusively ours. But we got some Buried Bible Podcast mugs. Mark got them as a gift for Father's Day, and then I get one as well. So through your Father's Day gift, I also am gifted.
You betcha.
First time anybody's ever admitted I'm gifted. Pretty good how I slid that in there. Also,
I think you're special.
Thank you. Also, had to wear my Vikings shirt today since by the time this episode comes out, it'll be that next week will be the beginning of football. So
are they still in the NFL?
Skull Vikes. All right. Well, we'll find out by the end of the year if people are like, holy cow, your team won the Super Bowl, which I'm not claiming is going to happen.
How'd they do in the playoffs last year? Who did they play?
Doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hey, the famous Viking motto is there's always next year. And then we get our hopes up, and then they wait for your hopes to be just right, and then they disappoint you. But I'm a big diehard football fan. Love my Vikings, and it's really good because being a Vikings fan, which I'm raising my boys up into, perseverance, faith, hope,
humility,
suffering. Yeah, teaches you a lot of good life skills.
I shouldn't make fun of it, actually, because as a baseball aficionado,
Is that still on TV?
Yeah. In 1934, the Brooklyn Dodgers weren't very good. The New York Giants were very good. They were in first place. And somebody was interviewing the manager of the Giants, Bill Terry, about the chances of Brooklyn. He said, are they still in the league? At the end of the year, the Giants lost the pennant because they had to play the Dodgers twice. The Dodgers avenged themselves on the Giants, and the Cardinals won the pennant and the World Series. And the phrase, is Brooklyn still in the league, became a phrase. Evidently, it died out at some point.
Must have been so cool to listen to that game on the radio. How exciting.
Well,
fun times.
Yes, it was the only time that I didn't hear Vin Scully on the radio. But anyway, the Dodger announcer, who probably would have been about 7 at the time. All right. Anyway.
Speaking of ancient history, we'll dive in. We're going back. We are diving into part 2 of the Tower of Babel. Going to focus on the Tower of Babel. Yes, I'm going to say Tower of Babel, even though I'm from Wisconsin and we pronounce it Babel. Tower of Babel. Mark, take us away. Teach us.
Babel, tomato. It's, vase, it's all good to me. By the way, before we go any further, a very brief note about a kid's book, Mabel and the Tower of Babel. If you don't have it, get it. We got ours, I think, ex libris out of a library. I was doing a fellowship at Brown University, I think in 1995, and we found this little book and read it to our kids, and it became like an urban legend with our house. You just mentioned Mabel. John Ryan is the author. Mabel is the fictional daughter of the king and queen of Babel, and she clearly is a Yahweh believer, and so she's arguing against her parents that you shouldn't be doing these things. It's wrong. It won't work if you build a tower. And of course, she was absolutely right. And I'll give you a spoiler alert at the end of the book. The favorite part for me, of course, is that
the pictures.
Yeah, thank you. No pop-ups, though. I'm sorry for you. But so Mabel is now sort of sad that she was right, because she has to learn all these new languages in cuneiform. And yes, girls did learn cuneiform. We do know that there were female scribes, if you're wondering. Not a lot of them, but at least we have a couple of names here and there. So Mabel is authentic. And of course, it rhymes with lots of other names. Now, before I go any further, the point for me, remember, I'm not a biblical scholar. I think I've said that a couple times, and people castigate me for that. They even got upset that I call myself a Mesopotamian scholar too. And so perhaps I'm neither, but I'm going to try to look at the story of Babel in a Mesopotamian context. But before I do that, of course, whenever, you just ask the average person on the street, what's the Babel story about? Oh, some big tower, and everybody's languages got confused. So I'm going to try to provide a Mesopotamian context to it. And by the way, though I'm going to read the text in a few minutes, doesn't take very long. The literal meaning was not that people had one language, it's that they had one lip. And I'm going to apologize in advance to my colleague Wayne Pittard, although I'm going to apologize in advance and then laugh about it. My colleague years ago, Wayne Pittard, in fact, it was in the 90s, I egged him on to give a presidential address with one of his graduate paper spoofs when he was at Harvard. In probably the late 70s, I'm guessing, is when he wrote this. And so here's his paper, "The Language of the One-Lipped People, the Epoch-Making Discovery of Proto-Sophatic." And he actually gave this talk at the Midwest American Oriental Society / Society of Biblical Literature meeting on February 13th, 1995. I introduced the speaker, and so I knew what was going to happen. And I'm going to read an excerpt or two out of it. What happens if you take text very literally? Now, and I'll give you a modern day example. If Keegan and I are in agreement with something and we say, we're of one mind, most of you are probably aware of the fact that we do not literally share a brain. We don't really. But of course, what would it mean to be of one mind? You're in agreement. But if you took the term literally, it would be quite messy. So Wayne takes this literally. And by the way, Wayne was a hilarious guy, but he's kind of like the Bob Newhart of ancient Near Eastern studies. He just was very matter of fact, and he would say something that was quite hilarious, but you had to think about it after a while. So I'm going to read it, just a couple sentences out of the paper, and then maybe just drop it. He says, "I well remember the day when I realized that people have been misinterpreting Genesis 11:1 for centuries, and have therefore misunderstood the whole linguistic point of the story of the Tower of Babel. The critical issue is in 11:1. It's usually translated, all the earth had one language and few words. Now, most of you are aware that the word translated here as language is sapha, which in the primary meaning is for language is a secondary one. The concrete meaning, of course, is lip. One day, as I was pondering the story of the tower, it suddenly struck me that we have failed to see what is happening in the narrative because we have tried to allegorize the word lip out of the text. It struck me that we should read the text literally, and then we could see everything clearly. All the earth had one lip and few words." Well, of course, they didn't have very many words. Just try to speak with one lip. "Suddenly, the entire development of language began to fall into place." I'm almost done, don't worry. "Before the Tower of Babel, humans only had one lip, and we will prove shortly it was the upper lip. This important point indicates that early humans had no lower jawbone at all, since the lower lip is a natural appendage to that part of anatomy. The flow of the Babel story is then, in those days, people only had one lip and a language circumscribed by that situation. But when the group in Shinar began to build the tower, Yahweh was forced to do something that would confuse the words that could be spoken at the time he created the jawbone and placed it on all people." Now, you would think, all right, is the paper over? Yeah, Wayne continued on, and it got worse because he began looking into the matter to find out, is there any archaeological evidence for people without a lower jawbone? And of course, many of you out there who are archaeology geeks are probably well aware that that's very true at the ancient site of Jericho, pre-pottery Neolithic B. I began to examine the skeletal remains from the early periods, and over again I found skull after skull without a jawbone. This is absolutely true, by the way. Extraordinary evidence of the situation is quite noticeable, for example, at pre-pottery Neolithic B, at Jericho, and he names a few other sites that I'm not going to do, but it wasn't even just one site. A number of skulls which have been covered carefully with clay and modeled presumably to resemble the person to whom the skull belonged, but they did not possess an accompanying jawbone. The proof is in the pudding. He continues on. And of course, by the very end of it, by the way, he tried to say, well, what things could you say if you did not have a lower lip? By the way, you do have a tongue. And so, of course, you'd be slobbering quite a lot too. And you're thinking, this really hurts, Wayne. Can't you stop? No. And he gives all the comments. By the way, right to Wayne. He's emeritus at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Just don't tell him I sent you. And at the very end, he says, never mind. But he says, I'd like to point out that this kind of foolishness is not always restricted to the lunatic fringe of biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies, although we see it coming often enough. And so we can think of maybe the Anunnaki and the Nibiru. Sorry, guys out there who still believe in that stuff. It actually happens with white other things. An author who makes a big splash and shows up in the New York Times by identifying Moses with Akhenaten. And of course, there was some guy named Freud who wrote a whole book about Moses sitting under the feet of Akhenaten. Sorry, I don't think it happened. Although, really, I think Freud knew as much about biblical studies as I know about psychoanalysis. Just a thought. In fact, he wrote more books on that stuff. Anyway, thank you, Wayne, for this. And like I said, I apologize in advance for all the people who are going to be coming after you. I haven't talked with Wayne for a few years, and so this might happen. Now, let me read the text. And like I said, I'm not going to alter everything for you. I'm going to provide, I think, a deeper perspective, and it's not going to be shocking in this vein. When I talked about the early chapters of Genesis, I believe that the writer, it wasn't the only and primary purpose, but they certainly were responding to Mesopotamian traditions about the origin of the universe. That's certainly happening with the stars and with other things. I even think when I'm talking about Genesis 15, when God is having the implements pass through the animal parts, clearly they're representing something from Mesopotamia. It could end up being a mockery. I don't know yet. There's just isn't enough information for it. And so is this possible that it's happening also in Genesis 11? My answer is yes, absolutely yes, in a couple of different ways. And so we're going to be looking into see what is the background and context to which the writer is writing. Is it relevant for the immediate audience? And my answer is yes, except that here's the other question I'm going to bring up, but I'm going to not answer it probably for weeks and weeks on end, is the whole issue is when was the book of Genesis written and by whom? And by the way, the answer is to both of those is not singular in any event. In my particular opinion. And so do I believe there was a real Babel story? Yes. Do I believe the story is now made relevant for a later period audience? Yes. And so, in fact, I think you see the same thing with the story of Nimrod. From that standpoint, Nimrod looks very much like a Mesopotamian empire builder, like the great Sargon of Akkad, but he also looks like a Neo-Assyrian hunter king, and the cities that he takes care of in the north, especially, are late period cities. And so how does that work? It's being made relevant for probably a late period audience when the final edition of the text is being written. Yes, it's all divinely inspired. I have no problem with that. But like I said, authorship is a different animal. It's text-based rather than author-based in the ancient Near East. And I'll take a stab at trying to explain that in a couple of weeks. But we might want to build our audience before I alienate everyone. So let me just read it and then start making comments on it. So now remember, I told you last week, I think chapter 11 comes before chapter 10. So this is purposeful. Remember what the word was? Dischronalization, something like that. By the way, when you're a pointy-headed academic, you could make up a long word that costs 25-cent word, and nobody's going to call you on it. But they should, by the way. And so in other words, they're purposely putting them in out of chronological orders is what my explanation is. So now the whole earth was used the same language. Remember, it's the same lip and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Guy, that kind of means that they must have been in the west somewhere or the north. And if I'm right about Shinar being the Hebrew phrase for southern Mesopotamia, perhaps coming from Shumer, which is the Akkadian form of the term, and if not something else, but it's certainly Babylonia, they had to come from somewhere else. Where were they marching from? And I think Eden was in the north, near the confluence of the Tigris and the Euphrates and other places, if it wasn't cosmic geography, if it was actually earthly geography. And I discussed that in earlier sections, and I don't want to talk more about it here because that would sort of hurt my brain. So, then of course we have this cool direct speech. So they settled in the land of Shinar from the north or the west or somewhere. They said to one another, verse 3, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." This is New American Standard, if you're wondering. And they use brick for stone and they use tar for mortar. You ever wonder what that means? What are they talking about there? And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name." And of course, let us make ourselves a name is really a way of saying, let's become famous. People will talk about us even after we're dead. And of course, that's how you make yourself a name. That's how Gilgamesh wants to make himself a name. By the way, Nimrod and Gilgamesh, they're not the same guy. I'm sorry. Lots of people were trying to argue that. And I wrote back and said, and your evidence for this is, and I didn't get an answer. So let's go on. So, and otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. And of course, commentators have for centuries made the allusion, this is probably an allusion to the marching orders we were given in Genesis 1 about spreading throughout all the earth. And so they haven't done it yet. And when is the time that they haven't done it? Well, it's the time during the Tower of Babel, by the way. You're not going to get me to give you any strict chronology on this. And then 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men have built. People have actually tried to make the argument that this shows that the God of Israel was not omniscient, because it's like, why did he come down? Didn't he know what they were doing already? Well, again, the writer already knows that God knows everything. He just decided to have a visit, at this point. And the Lord said in verse 6, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one lip." That's interesting. That's sort of the phrase are comparative there. They're a single people with a single lip. And if I think that you could use that and it's the same like the single mind, that would actually make a lot of sense. In other words, they're all together. They're in unison. That might be a way of looking at it. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose will do will be impossible for them. And so now God says, come, let us go down, and they're confused their language. Oh no. Is that the same phrase that was used in Genesis 1 that we discussed, whether it was the Trinity? You kept on asking me like 57 times, isn't it really, is it the Trinity? Isn't it the Trinity? And my answer is, you're not going to get anybody listening to this in the late Bronze Age or early Iron to understand the Trinity. So no, it's God's heavenly court. That's my answer. He's discussing it with his heavenly court, and there will confuse their language, their lips, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. And now we have our teleology. Therefore, the name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language, Balal. So that's the pun there, by the way, of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Okay. And by the way, the whole earth there is clearly in fact, by definition, it must be an exaggeration, because they're not over the whole earth before. It says the whole earth had, one lip. Okay. By the way, that would really be tough if it was just the whole earth. But the point is that they're not over the whole earth. That's the whole point of this. And so God will scatter them. And of course, the proof of the scattering is you going back one chapter. Why do they put 11 before, after 10? Well, I guess it's the mind of the writer. And then the story's over, and let's go back to the genealogies now. And so we have this, we have the interlude with Nimrod. We now have the interlude with Babel. And of course, the interludes are really important because it sort of breaks up the genealogies. And by the way, if you're the listener listening to this, you're probably really glad that the genealogies are broken up. Like, oh man, this is really tough. Give me a breather. Oh, I'll give you a Nimrod breather. Now I'll give you a Babel breather. And is Nimrod the king of Babel? Well, every commentator in antiquity thought that, with good reason, of course. If Nimrod just became the guy who built Babel and all these other cities, and then we're talking about Babel, it's like, wow, who knew Nimrod must be the Babel ruler? And of course, like I said, it's not his real name. And so what's his real name? It's the Babel builder. I don't know what his real name is. We may never find it. But I know people hate the idea of not knowing something. And so I know we can give him a name. How about Elmer Fudd? But anyway, since people were castigating me for that too. Now, let's try to look at this from my very decided Mesopotamian perspective. And again, this is not the only way to look at the story, but I think it provides a context for the story which does not contradict the traditional views, but I think it adds texture to them, which, I don't know, I think it matures them more and maybe helps me understand a bit more about it. Because really, what's the traditional view? God came down, found out that, well, they're speaking one language, and oh man, if we don't do something about this, they're gonna take over everything. So let's confuse their language. It's like, didn't you know that was going to happen? I mean, and of course, on the other hand, as you could probably say, is, well, didn't they know? Didn't they know this period? How could you not know God? And of course, God does know, and this is simply a way of explaining the story with some direct speech, which is pretty cool. Well, think about it. There's speech from the Babelites, and there's speech from God in his heavenly council. When God decides to end up acting, he's acting all alone. I suppose it's like a president talking to his cabinet, and then he goes out and says what he's going to do after he's getting his advice, which he may or may not listen to. Well, we won't worry about that part. And of course, there actually are a lot of places in the Old Testament that talk about God interacting with his heavenly council. They're usually called the sons of God. Now, recently, in the past couple of years, there have been a number of journal articles by pointy-headed ancient Near Eastern / Mesopotamian / biblical scholars on the Babel story, trying to look at it in its Mesopotamian context. And I was really happy. Two of them are in a journal, which for a lot of you is probably pretty obscure, but it is in English. It's called the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. So I'm going to talk about two of these articles and address some of the things that they say in them to see whether or not we can sort of crystallize some of the things that are going on here, because I really think that the story of Babel as it stands is a reaction to the power and the arrogance and the so-called brilliance of those living in Mesopotamia. And I'm wondering, my take, I'll tell you the end from the beginning. I really think that the final edition of this is probably done during the Jewish exile. And so they're looking back on it. And of course, they're probably looking around at the great city of Babylon, the greatest city in the world in the 6th century BC. There's no doubt about it. They're seeing all these great temple towers, libraries, temples, etc. And the great wisdom that is coming from all them. They're probably thinking about the great epic that would be read at New Year's in Babylon, the Enuma Elish, and the arrogance that was brought forth. And here are the Jews, of course. They're the losers. They've come in. They've been deported to Babylon and surrounding areas. They're probably learning the traditions and the language, etc. You think of someone like Daniel, or think of someone like Ezekiel. Both clearly are from the educated class. So did they learn cuneiform? Probably, or at least the traditions. And so if you think of the possibility of this story, that they're taking an ancient story and they're dressing it up into a contemporary context to mock Babylon and perhaps even Assyria in some regard. If you think of that, this will all make more sense. And in fact, I believe that the author here, the anonymous author, is consciously making fun of the Enuma Elish with some of the phrases that are in here, which of course for 2,000 years we read them in a vacuum, and now we can read them in context. So here are the two articles. One is by young scholar, really, really smart guy. I have not met him as far as I know, Samuel Boyd, who's out of the University of Colorado Boulder, and his article is called Sargon's Dur Sharukan Cylinder, Inscription and Language Ideology, a Reconsideration and Connection to Genesis 11:1-9. By the way, he even wrote a book out of Augsburg Press on the Babel story and its connections with the Near East. But I think the article is very succinct, and it really helps me understand it. His particular argument is about a phrase that is found in Sargon's cylinder inscription. Who's Sargon and what's his cylinder inscription? Sargon is the king of Assyria who he's either primarily or partially responsible for the conquest of this kingdom of Israel, the Samaritan kingdom in the north. His dates were about 721 to 705. Those are dates of rule, by the way. He wasn't 16 when he died. And we have a number of his inscriptions. He is mentioned one time in the Bible in Isaiah chapter 20, and clearly he is someone that is very well known to the audience. It would be kind of like somebody in Europe bringing up Hitler or Stalin. Like, don't say anything else. We know exactly who you're talking about. Our family life was changed forever because of them. Or earlier, like someone like a Napoleon. So this is what Boyd argues. And it's hard to tell whether, Boyd's training, whether he's a biblical scholar or Mesopotamian scholar. He clearly is able to put one foot in both of these. So Sargon is Sargon II of Assyria. He has he built the city of Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. He named it after himself. What a guy! And it was excavated by Botai in the 19th century, and then later on, scores and scores of tablets are found. This one particular inscription is very interesting for some of the phrases that it uses that seem to echo the beginning of this chapter of Genesis 11. So here's his argument. He says, in recent years, Sargon's this cylinder inscription has occupied center stage, particularly in the writings of biblical scholars of discussions regarding the use of language in the Assyrian Empire to consolidate subordinated groups. The Assyrian Empire, basically, by the time of Sargon and his son Sennacherib, who's of course very, very well known as an anti-hero in the book of 2 Kings 18 and 19 and elsewhere. He's like the arch enemy of arch enemies in the Bible. Their empire spread from southwestern Iran all the way to Egypt and into Turkey, and of course every region in between. So a vast area, the largest empire in the history of the world up to that time. It would basically mimic the later Persian and Alexander empires in terms of size, but also in terms of cultural and linguistic diversity. And so there's a phrase that is used in here that he literally argues that the phrase in the Bible, people of one lip or one language, is really not about language. It's about uniformity or conformity of purpose, which, by the way, would actually make a lot of sense in the biblical text, in my opinion. So for example, he writes, so here's a portion of the cylinder inscription that he has translated here. Sargon is talking about his conquests and the fact that he's basically uniting everything. And of course, if you're a good king, you're very propagandistic and everything's going great. He says the subjects of the four regions are the four corners of the earth. If you're the king of the four quarters, you're basically admitting that you're ruling everything. And so it's probably no accident that even Nimrod had 4 cities each, or at least if we count them in one way. He said the subject of the 4 regions were foreign people of non-harmonious speech that wasn't the same, dwellers of mountains and lands, as many as the light of the gods, Lord of all, guides, whom by the order of Assur, or Ashur, my lord, he's the king of the gods for the Assyrians, with the power of my scepter, I plundered, all made them act with one mouth, literally. And the translation here is, I made them act in concert. And the phrase there, act with one mouth, seems to be alluded to, and if you think of it, it's probably the same as the one in Genesis 11, when the people were of one lip. It really is probably talking about the fact that they were a people in one accord. They were all in agreement, and that's the phrase. And this phrase is used, now we find out, multiple times in Akkadian, in the Assyrian dialect, and in the Babylonian dialect. I settled them in the midst of Dur-Sharrukin, natives of Assyria, masters of every craft. I dispatched them as overseers and officials to teach them correct behavior, namely to fear God and the king. And so, if this is the case, which of course makes a lot of sense, and by the way, there are multiple examples of this that he brings up. So, And so I'm on page 89, and this is what Boyd says. As stated above, I claim that Genesis 11 is not a story about language, and rather that the idioms that have been translated such concern political action and not in the authority to govern. And then he argues, I'm not the first one to actually bring it up this way, but he's now doing it in a journal article, and it was 2019 that this came out. Let's go a little bit further. What was the next page I was going to bring up? Oh, here's my other note here. Sargon's son Sennacherib also has the same phrase for this, and so I'm going to bring that up very briefly. If we're slow moving today, it's I'm trying to do this without heavy breathing, of course, if you remember. So I'm on page 97. First, there's actually if you wonder what isn't this an old story? Shouldn't this be earlier? Shouldn't there be an example from an earlier period? Here's an old Babylonian omen text that has the same phrase. An omen, the whole of the land will be of one mind, or literally the whole of the land will be made one. This is actually an omen text from Goethe's Old Babylonian omen text. This would be about 1800 BC and following. When I taught Akkadian, I would actually have students translate from Goethe's text. It was not fun for them, actually for me either. But so the phrase evidently is something that is found at least over a millennium. And so if you like, we could say that it's an earlier phrase. And Sargon's son Sennacherib brings up the same thing. He's when Sennacherib became king, he talked about certain cities that were going against him and evil kings. In fact, this Awubidi, he's called an evil Hittite. In fact, all Hittites are evil. He caused the city of Arpad and other cities to rebel against me, and he made them act in unison. Of course, the phrase "their act in unison" was they all acted in one mouth. And so the phrase is that, and then even the next generation, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, that's the 2 generations later actually, when his brother was in rebellion, he says that his brother made all of the lands hostile again against me, and then he said he made them all of one mouth, meaning that they were put together to act in unison against me. If we think of that phrase in this way, and I think that Boyd has made a really, really strong case for this.
So all the examples you're giving, just to clarify, are all the same, the exact same phrase and wording?
I wouldn't, it's not identical, but the phrase, it's clearly the same phrase. It's not 100% accurate, I suppose it'd be like saying, we were of one mind, we are of one mind. In other words, there's a past tense, there's a future tense, and other things like that. And so the phrase itself is clearly
the same.
It's the same from that standpoint, and of one mouth. Now, of course, somebody's going to say, well, man, the Bible says one lip. This is one mouth. If this is a figure of speech, they're using a figure of speech that, of course, translates from culture A to culture B. Does this make the Babel story later? No, not necessarily. It just shows that if you now put it this way, if you now go back onto the text itself, I think it does add a little bit of texture here. In other words, if this is a phrase that is known, and by the way, that term, the one lip term is rare in the Bible. You find it in 11:1, and then what is it, 11:7, when God is talking about 11:6 and then 11:7. And so they all have one lip, and then he's going to confuse their lip in 7. And the phrase isn't used again, although I suppose you could, there's one other place that you have the lip being used as a euphemism, and that's in Zephaniah, everybody's favorite minor prophet. And so 3:9, Zephaniah 3:9, here's the future. Of course, God is talking about the fact, for then in the future, this is the good part, after his burning anger, I will give the peoples purified lips, literally. But of course, what does that mean? That means basically clean speech. And what would clean speech be? Probably godly speech. It's kind of like taking God's name in vain. What does that mean? It means that you are not acting in the character of God, which is pretty all-encompassing if you think about it. It's not cursing. It's not saying dag nabbit or something. And so I'll give them purified speech, that all of them may call upon the name of Yahweh and will serve him in unison. This may be a good way of doing it. And that sort of implies that their speech is, again, one. So in other words, it's the only place I could find that we might have this type of figure of speech. And like I said, if it is a euphemism from Akkadian, whether the Assyrian version or the Babylonian version, I think that Boyd makes a really, really strong case. You'll have to read the rest of his article at this point. But I kind of like what he's doing here. And, one other thing, is there an allusion to the Babel story later on? In the book of Isaiah, this is Isaiah chapter 9, verses 8 and following. However, I'm not going to read out of the English translation from a Hebrew text. It's from the Septuagint. And of course, the Septuagint writers, like I said a couple weeks ago, always make reference to the text and they translate it for their immediate audience to make it relevant for them. And they didn't think they were doing anything wrong when they did it. So I don't think they were either. It's interesting in Isaiah chapter 9, this is the Septuagint translation. The Lord has sent death upon Jacob, and it has come upon Israel. So it's a judgment upon Israel. And all the people of Ephraim, which of course is the northern kingdom, and they that dwelt in Samaria shall know, who say in their pride and lofty heart. Of course, this is anticipating the fall of Samaria. And then verse 10, the bricks are fallen down, but come, let us use stones and cut down sycamores and cedars, and let us build for ourselves a tower. Now, that's not literally what it says in the Isaiah 9 passage, but that's how the Septuagint writer changed it. So I think that's rather interesting and telling. You got some more questions, I bet.
Yeah, I do. And I think the first one would be, because I think the major argument is always when you take a phrase like the language and then you claim, well, it's one lip. Well, the whole story is kind of wrapped around that euphemism. And so I think, let's say it is. I think people have a hard time because they go, okay, well, you say it's one lip, but then they're going to go to the next verse and go, well, God confused their language. So see, it's talking about language. Your argument back to that would be?
I'll explain that in the next podcast, number one. Number two, why can't both things be true? In other words, I'm not arguing that this is about a confusion of languages. All I'm saying is, but you think about it, there are two phrases in 11:1, and I'm not going to parse them right now because remember, that's really not what I do. I'm trying to explain it from an ancient Near Eastern perspective. The whole earth used the same language, one lip, and they had the same words, which is I think it's the only place in biblical Hebrew that we have that phrase, and it's an odd one, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's either repetitious, in other words, I don't know whether it's like a hendiadys, like Genesis 1, where we're made in the image and likeness of God, and it really is two things together that make the whole. And so I'm not exactly sure what that means. And so it it also could be a pun. In other words, what's the strength of a pun? Because you understand the double meaning between the two, between the words, and you realize that I've just reversed and I've used meaning A where it's supposed to be meaning B. And so if you think of that, and I'm also going to try to show you in the next podcast that there's also a Babylonian context to this, is that if they are trying to make fun of Babylonian wisdom and power, the whole point of Enuma Elish is that Marduk built the universe on the power of his speech after his defeat of Tiamat. And so what should we do here? We're going to confuse their speech. They were all in one accord. That's the lip. They all had the same words. Okay, that maybe is referring to speech. And so if they're doing that, in other words, I've always looked at it and said it's sort of there's something missing here. So God came down and they were all they didn't leave, and so I'm just gonna send them off their way in different languages. To me, like there's a hole in it somewhere. It just but of course, especially as when you're a youngster, you're reading this, you're hearing about the story, and you sort of recognize that if you ask too many questions, they're just not going to get answered. And so, I had the answer, it was gone from me for, decades upon decades, before I started really, studying Mesopotamian. This doesn't change. This tweaks the story. It doesn't overturn it. It doesn't upend it, in my opinion.
So then what's your argument, since your emphasis is just the fact that what it's actually talking about is the euphemism, but they very may well have still been of one actual language?
I don't know. Put this way, if they were, their speech is now confused. Whether they were a single language and they became multiple languages, I do not think that is the emphasis of the story. The emphasis of the story, of course, is their arrogance towards God, which I'm going to talk more about in our next session, because that's really the whole point. It's the arrogance of those in Babylon, and it's the ancient one, but it's also the current ones that we're living under, because of course, and so in a sense, this is part of Genesis. And I think if you think of Genesis as, this isn't 100% reason for it, but if it's a response to Mesopotamian civilization and its supposed brilliance, and they're showing that, oh, no, though we were defeated by you guys, our God is the true God, and everything about him is superior to everything that you do. And we can show it in subtle ways. In fact, this is so subtle, if you guys read it, you wouldn't even know you're being insulted.
Why wouldn't those still both be true? It's talking about physical language, and the whole emphasis of that could still be the arrogance.
It could be, of course. Babylon was able to overcome, both Assyria and Babylon were able to overcome the multiplicity of languages by making everyone of one lip, meaning that they were all, at least theoretically, they were all in agreement. And you and I are of one lip if we fear the king and we fear God in Assyria. And of course, in English, we'd be saying we're all of one mind. What was America called when I was a kid? A melting pot. In other words, we recognized there was a million different, multiplicity of cultures and even some languages, but we were all in agreement that we are, under one, entity. That was the ideal, of course. I think the principle is the same here, is that God sees that it's not so much that they're all together, it's the arrogance about it that is now going to be knocked down. And I think that's going to, I know you're not going to be satisfied with this, but that's what I'm going to be leaving you hanging with, is that when we get to the next article by Casey Clam, who wrote it this year, by the way, and I'll give you my spoiler alert about the article. It also happens to be in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, and she does reference Boyd's article. And so hers is called, and she's at the University of Notre Dame, at least she was when she wrote this. I don't know if she's teaching there. On the meaning and language of Genesis 11 and its Babylonian background, as if we have dueling articles. And it's really not, she's not arguing against Boyd at all, in my opinion. They have different perspectives on what they're looking at. And so it's the Babylonian self-aggrandizement of itself found in its founding creation epic that is now being alluded to in the Genesis 11 account that we would have never figured out before the discovery of the cuneiform civilizations. We never would have known this. And so this is why I've always been a little unsatisfied with this story, is that they were arrogant. They came up here, and so God confused their languages. Well, that something, I don't know. To me, there was a bolt missing somewhere, and I'm hoping that this at least, as usual, this might illuminate some things and make some more darkness in other places.
But wouldn't it make sense that after the flood, if you're coming from the standpoint of Noah and his family, only ones that survive, everybody's going to come from one language. Not that they couldn't be split off and made into other languages, but wouldn't that be the argument?
Yeah, of course, that's the rabbinical argument, and the tradition is, of course, is what do they speak? The same language that Adam spoke, Hebrew. It's a nice idea, but let's just take that from a literal standpoint. Think about it. Noah's got his 3 sons, and he's got a wife, and his 3 sons have got 3 wives, and do they all speak the same language that Noah and maybe they married some girls that speak, some native a language from Australia. What I'm saying is, I don't know. We don't know anything about it. The text is utterly uninterested in that issue. And so did everyone speak? They were all of one lip, and they spoke, and they had the same words, which, by the way, might be a Hebrew euphemism for the same thing. In other words, they were of one mind and in one accord, or something like that, or maybe we could say it this way: Keegan and I stand shoulder to shoulder when it comes to what we think of the Vikings, or what I'm saying is that, what does that mean? That we're in complete agreement. And another way of saying it would be of one mind. If those things are to be taken as euphemisms, that doesn't explain the confusion of languages later on. However, I'm going to try to explain that from a Babylonian perspective, and I think it'll make sense, is that they thought language was perfect, and they had the perfect language. And of course, what's the word Babylon? Babylon, by the way, does not mean confusion of languages. In Akkadian, it was the folk etymology was it was the city of the gate of the gods, or the gateway to the gods. And so, but the Hebrews, of course, are taking it, and what do? They make it into a term of derision. No, we'll say it's balal. It means confusion. You think your language is great? No, it's confusion. Kind of like the same way that who's the god mentioned, Baal-zebul? What is he called later on? Beelzebub, which means Lord of the Flies, rather than his original name. In other words, they're making fun of his name, and so it would like taking any political person that you think of that you don't like, and then of course mocking his name by making a nasty pun out of the name. I can't think of one, and I don't even want to. But the point is, all of you can think of one that you probably shouldn't use or bring up, and that's exactly what the Bible is doing, and I think that's what it's doing with Babylon here. You guys think you're so great. Actually, your name isn't Babel, it's Balal. Is the joke here. And so what happens if everyone gets confused? The languages are now confused. You're all dispersed, and you're no longer of one lip. Now, again, if I leave you hanging, you're going to be upset with this, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for it. All I ask you to do is be patient for the next episode when I talk about the Babylonian context for this. He's not satisfied.
No, I am, but
That's all right.
I feel like
I don't think we're of one lip about this right now.
No, but in I'm not claiming to be right. It's just me being curious.
Yeah.
And I always have to. I feel like my questions are always poking at it from 16 different angles, because then you brought up, well, we don't know if Noah's sons were married to women who had the same language, but the argument would be, okay, well, if we're going to make that argument, it's going to be assumed they at least could speak the same language.
Maybe it was like living in the Southwest.
But in an assumed, you know what I'm saying? If you're going to make a strong argument and you were to poll anybody, Noah, his sons, and then their married daughters, they could most likely communicate.
Well, they could communicate, but what language do you learn when you hear lullabies from your mommy? What if you have a Romanian mother and a American father? She's probably going to sing you Romanian lullabies. You know what I'm saying is that you're living in a bilingual household. And so what's the joke about if you live in the Southwest of the U.S. and you've got, let's say, Mexican and Anglo upbringing? What language do you speak? What was the joke when I was a kid? It was Spanglish. In other words, they were so perfectly fluent. And I remember listening to some of them speak, and you're thinking, wow, you're weaving in and out of Spanish. And it's like, well, actually. And so I don't know. We're making a lot out of nothing, I suppose. But the point is that we're not informed anything about language before this. Yeah. We're not.
Because at this time, in terms of when it's assumed the Tower of Babel would have been built, do we know how many different languages are being spoken at that time?
We don't know anything because we don't know. Here's the other thing that you people are, a lot of you are going to be bothered with. I don't know where to put this. I mean, if you take a strict literal rendering of the genealogies and their numbers from Adam to Noah, it's I think ballpark 1600 years. All right. Okay, let's just say that, and then from Noah to whenever this happens, a couple more centuries. How many? If you want to take that literally, how many languages can there be in 2,000 years? I don't know, probably a lot, because you think about it. How old is English? If you go, I know I mentioned this before. You go back 400 years, and we're pretty irritated if we have to read Shakespeare or King James Bible. We can understand it, but it's like, oh, come on. Just another century or two, or a couple earlier than that, you try to read Chaucer in the original. It's like, this is really hard. I got about half of it, maybe, if I'm lucky. Then you want to read, Beowulf. Well, it's not even English anymore. It's German. And we're just 1,000 years from the present, maybe a little bit earlier than that. The point is that language can go through tremendous modifications over centuries. But to me, that's a nice theory. To me, it's immaterial. And I know people have spent books on trying to figure all this out. And my answer is blowing in the wind. It's like the Bible is uninterested in that question. And so why are we spending all that time trying to figure it out? Were there multiple languages? My guess is probably, because you think about it.
That's just my job, though, is to get you to finally theorize. You know what I mean?
But think about it. Here are you and I. We're in a sense, we're 40 years apart in age, okay? And we can communicate with each other only because I've got kids your age and I've got grandkids, at the age of your kids. In other words, I know how everybody speaks. And so I know how words have changed and slang has changed, and just words that, some of you I'm not even going to tell you what the word is, but there's a particular word that meant something about a person who would hire people for prostitution that we would never use when we were kids. And then all of a sudden I hear my kids using the word, and I said, you can't use that word. And they said, Dad, it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. I'm thinking, well, it does for me, but the point is slang changes. Can you imagine? it's not just slang. It's life experience, etc. Just why do American English and British English speakers make fun of each other? Because they've seen how language has been modified over time. What's the joke? If you go over to England and you say I'm stuffed, I mean I'm full, but over there it could mean I'm pregnant. A little different, but the point is it's the same word. It has different meanings, but it's not just it's the way the word is presented. So could language have changed? Language is modified, and of course, as the language changes enough, that we call them either different dialects or different languages altogether. We cannot see. I do look at Genesis 11. And I've always argued this in my classroom, that Genesis 11 was a teleology about a theological explanation for why there were multiple languages. But I think it's deeper than that. That's one of the reasons for the story. And by the way, the languages, when they say that, the Genesis 10 text is really a very adequate understanding of the ethnic and linguistic composition of the Eastern Mediterranean world in the early first millennium. Okay, and of course, if the text is being written, then that's when it would be relevant. That's when it's relevant to, and so that's why they're writing at that point. Does that mean it's not divinely inspired? No, it's still divinely inspired. It just means that I better go back to the drawing board to figure out what divine inspiration means. So I think that if we get too caught up in language, we're gonna miss some of the salient points of the story, which, like I said, are probably referring to things in Mesopotamia that we wouldn't otherwise have known. And by the way, I know you're thinking, well, what a stinker. Why are you the only one who knows this? No, lots of Mesopotamian scholars know this. The problem is that we're really, like I keep on saying every time, we've really been lousy at making ourselves available to outsiders, even biblical scholars. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. And so so I can make this available. You can look this stuff up yourself. You won't need me to look it up. It's available. Everything is on the internet now. You can find this stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And like I said, I'm just curious. So I like poking around and trying to look at it from different angles, because the main argument, and I think the main argument people are going to have is, well, the main and plain reading, and the way we've always understood it, which we do not like to have our cages rattled in the first place, but then this just the easier understanding, the main and plain, is if anybody reads it, it just sounds like they all spoke one language. This is how we got multiple languages. That's it.
But really, if you think about it, the point of the story is that's simply the mode with which to knock down the humans who are in rebellion. Remember, Nimrod's name is "Let us rebel." Why isn't Nimrod mentioned in Genesis 11? Probably purposely to keep his name out of it so he doesn't get a name. And of course, like I keep on saying, it's not his name anyway, little rebel. And so the confusion of language is simply the mode in which God will have his way with humans, with this rebellion. And if you think of this, and I know this is how Mike Heiser took it. And by the way, Mike Heiser didn't do anything new that Near Eastern / biblical scholars had been discussing amongst themselves. Rebellion number 1, of course, is the Eden story. Rebellion 2 would be the prelude to the flood with the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the Nephilim / Upkalu, which I talked about. And then rebellion number 3 is here. And if Nimrod is called the term for giant, which of course can either be taken as a physical giant or a great person, it makes you think and connects you to the Genesis 6 story somehow. I don't know how that is, by the way. I'm sure some of you are going to tell me. But if you think of it that way, and if you're reading this, I mean, how long does it take to read from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11? If you're listening to this, you're going to see those interconnections pretty easily. Okay. I don't think that we see them as well. And so here's number one. And of course, what happens with Genesis 11? God, now we have the 70 nations, the 70, ethnicons, if you use the Septuagint, I suppose. And what does God do at this point? They're assigned a heavenly being on each of them. And what does he do? I'm going to take one of them. But of course, before I take them, I've got to call somebody out. And of course, that's the Abraham story, which happens immediately after this. After a little bit more genealogy, then, of course, we have the Abraham story at the end of 11 and beginning of 12. And everyone is listening to this, anticipating, oh, so that's how God... So in other words, God's got it all under control. He knows what he's doing. He's dispersed people. And of course, what does the whole earth mean to an Israelite? Let's say even in the Iron Age, it's as far as you can see. What are the four corners of the earth for an Israelite? Now, you're saying the earth doesn't have four corners. It's a figure of speech. Well, the northernmost would be probably northern Turkey. That's as far as they know. The easternmost would be probably Libya and the Mediterranean area, Tarshish maybe, Tarshish. In other words, they know about what we would call later on the Pillars of Hercules or the what's his name? The Arabic name, Gibraltar.
I was not going to.
Straits
You're looking
of
at me to help
Gibraltar.
you out. That was not happening.
Thanks, you're a big help. And I can't because it's getting too close to the modern age. My knowledge base dissipates tremendously as we get into the AD period, and then you go as far east, Iran, and the far south is really Kush and Sudan. That's their world, and so for them, that's the whole world. Is there more world than that? Well, we know that, and did the writers know that? No, they didn't know that. They didn't know that at all. And so why would you expect them to use phrases that would be aware of that? They wouldn't.
They can't say some of the world when they don't know this is some of the world.
As you know, there's more of the world than this. And so we're just going to, as much as they knew, they spread out. That doesn't make that doesn't fly with me. They're writing to a real people in a real context, and you're using phrases that are understandable to them in that context.
Yeah, so we're missing the emphasis on, we're so focused on it being of one language, but the emphasis is on the scattering of the people and sending them out.
And that's the mode. The real emphasis is on the arrogance of the people in their rebellion with King Rebel. Who doesn't even get to be named in this story, but and so if he's if they're rebelling against God because they're making a name for themselves in this great temple tower, and of course there are temple towers all over southern Mesopotamia where the Judahites would have been at this point. They're looking around and they're saying, man, these guys are arrogant. They think they know something, and they don't know anything. Their wisdom is empty. I suppose it would be kind of like what Tertullian does when he argues, when here's this classical man who becomes a believer at the end of the 2nd century BC, and his first comment is to basically emancipate himself from Greco-Roman wisdom by saying, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? In other words, I'm rejecting he's part of it and he's rejecting it. In fact, Tertullian in many respects is kind of like a classical period Abraham, although we don't know Abraham's mindset. That's the whole point of the Abraham story. How much of his Mesopotamian roots does Abraham have to shed? Tertullian sheds it, and then 2 centuries later, Augustine is saying, no, I can embrace the good parts of it. If you look at Genesis 10 as a reaction against Mesopotamian, culture and arrogance and rebellion, and there was a real rebellion, and now we're basically going to write the story from the standpoint of our time period and situation. This is what we come up with, and of course, I keep on saying that that's the next half of this, or the next third of the Babel story, is by looking at the looking at the context and how the Babel story is clearly making reference and mocking the Enuma Elish, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's been difficult I'm trying to stay away from those questions, the tower and what's happening. And I do want to speak and ask questions based on that, the third rebellion and what's really going on, but I'm doing my best to, which is why I'm focusing on the language itself. So a couple more questions and then we'll finish up, and I'll have you kind of just tell people what they can expect in the next episode. But my question would be in terms of early sources and like rabbinic material, how did they take it? Or did they take it the way that most people take it? And your argument would be it was a lost context we didn't have because, again, through archaeology and finding these other texts, we're learning more on puns since the context was lost.
I wasn't nearly as interested in it, except that there is one first century AD writer I've mentioned before. His name is Philo, who, when he talks about the Babel story, and in fact, let me see if I can find the note. If I can't find it in about 10 seconds, then I'll just tell you about this. Where is Philo here? Philo is page 102. Okay, this is in Boyd's article on page 102. Yeah, that's even better. Here we go. So Boyd, the idea is on page 102, left-hand column. The idea behind this phrasing in Genesis 11 for Philo and other ancient interpreters also included the meaning to act in unison. In other words, the idea that the one lip was talking about singularity of purpose. And he gives the citation. Let's see. Oh no, he doesn't give the Philo citation here. Excuse me. So that's my, and I failed to go look it up myself. But of course, that really makes a lot of sense. Philo is the guy who loves to make the Old Testament into an archetype, and I can understand why. Philo is living now in the Greco-Roman age. He's, in many respects, you can tell there's some Platonic elements in him where he's allegorizing everything. In fact, another brilliant Greek philosopher who becomes a Christian does this, although he got labeled as a heretic later on. That's Origen, and he saw what he saw. He saw the supposed inconsistencies in the Bible, and so he allegorizes them. And so there was the deeper spiritual meaning, and that's what Philo does. And so it's not surprising that he would even allegorize the Genesis 11 passage. But for the most part, they took it pretty literally that this is a confusion of speech, and that they were of single speech. I think Josephus does too, but I didn't bother to look up.
So it could just be a both and then.
I think so. It's not like it's
because
one
that's what
other.
It says in 11:1. Because is the word here for when it says one language, that's the one lip.
That's the one lip.
And a common speech.
And single words.
Single words.
Yeah. So, which is an awkward, and I don't think that phrase is used anywhere in the Bible. So it's like, what does it mean? And I'm guessing it complements the one lip, but I don't know exactly how.
Yeah, so it's kind of framing that in.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
So it might also talk about singularity of purpose too.
And could it possibly just also be talking about the people who are actually going to be at Babel or Babel? Again, I guess I already messed that up. You know what I mean? In terms of, so as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Okay, well, why couldn't the people who settled there be one tribe or the original people, until the people who literally settled there and started building up for this Tower of Babel. Couldn't that group have literally just been of common speech, but also in their common speech as the people group who founded there and settled there, also been of one mind and unison of
Sure,
here we
why
go, let's
not?
rebel.
Why not? I'm good with it.
You're not you're not helping.
I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. That's a reasonable possibility. He said as he was snickering over here. No, I don't know. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I know people like certainty, and I know in the last episode, somebody wrote, I watched the whole thing just to find out that you don't know who Nimrod is. And I said, yeah, that was the whole point. That was the method in exhausting all possibilities.
So let's just start opening up our episodes to say, hey, today we're going to talk about how they're the one-lipped people, but let us save you some time. We don't know. That's always my joke, is when I ask you a question, I say, Mark, if you don't know, there's no way I know, so I'm really in trouble. Nothing.
I got nothing.
Okay, random one. A little bit off topic, but based on this, and it's going off that whole world thing. It's written in a similar way of that of Noah. They don't know anything is beyond them.
Right.
I'm not getting into the flood. I'm tempted.
We'll get there at some point.
My ADD calls me that way. But I guess this would be similar to the other question, which would just be, it could just be the Mesopotamian people.
It could be.
And then is that possible that the Mesopotamian people, because God scatters them, their languages get confused? Like in actuality, in the same way of when we moved from, right, we come here and we settle in America, well, we spoke English, but because we scattered, look at our context for our languages, the words we use, just like you had said earlier. Well, it does confuse the languages, and it changes in the context and the meaning. I mean, even our accents are different. I'm a little bit bummed that we are the ones that lost the cool accent, in my opinion, but either way. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, but and it talks about the whole earth in Genesis 6. Is that the same as the whole earth in Genesis 11? My answer is perhaps.
Or it's just talking about these people scattered them. Because then you get into the people where, okay, if they're literally all right there and then they scattered, then you're talking about, well, was it Pangea, not Pangea? I don't want to get into all that. But the whole point could be like, for them, they're scattered amongst the whole group. These people group, these Mesopotamian, and I get maybe a little bit extended, those people all became of one mind, and God's like, scatter them.
Yep, that's right. And because of one mind, because of their arrogance and rebelliousness, it's not simply that they're of one mind. It's what they're doing with it. And so, yeah. And so all these other questions are ancillary and fun to think about, as long as you don't take them so seriously or create a theology on them. At least that's my opinion.
All right. I'm tempted to go there. I won't go there. So I'll have you just share a little bit about what we'll talk in the next episode. This was, again, very singularly focused on the language aspect. I'm assuming our next episode will expand our horizons.
Yes, we'll expand to the rest of the 9 verse section by talking about how the writer is mocking and referencing the Babylonian, I suppose you could say, quote unquote, their own Bible, the Enuma Elish, which we think was like I said, right on their New Year's, which glorifies the city of Babylon and its god Marduk, and the brilliance of wisdom and language, etc. And that's all, and their ability to build things, and of course even that weird phrase, brick for stone, or what's wrong with that? It's because they can't even use the right building materials. These guys, there's mockery going on here and there that we couldn't have seen without the Mesopotamian context. That's all I'm saying. Is, like I said, it doesn't alter. It doesn't get rid of the ancient our interpretation with a steam shovel. It simply modifies and perfects it. And so now I'm going to try to show you that because of this Mesopotamian context, they are the story as it is written is intrinsically important, but it's also responding to their current situation, which is their captivity.
Boom.
Boom.
All right. Well, thanks for joining. As always, drop some comments below, like, subscribe, share, and yeah, we'll see you next time when we do part 2. Maybe it'll be the last Babel. We never know. So we'll dive in deeper into the Tower of Babel. See ya.